Hello, class. Okay, so for this week, we're going to be discussing critical trends, politics, embodiment, and health. And there's a few things that I actually want to discuss about your midterm exam. So if you click here on the midterm exam, as you know, the midterm is, oops, I'm sorry. There's a typo here. I got to fix this. But as you know, the midterm exam is 30% of your grade. And I actually said that I was going to open it on, I believe, Tuesday, but I'm going to go ahead and open it starting Monday at 9 a.m. and it'll be open until Friday at 5 p.m. So it gives you extra days to basically get started on your midterm. I'm actually going to show you the question now so that you can build a understanding or like a framework for how you want to write your essay. But basically, it's a one essay question that's going to focus on material from the videos, the lectures, all of that together. But don't worry, you do not have to have it by memory. It is an open book exam, which means you can have your notes out, the lectures, all of that. And I recommend that you work on a separate Google Doc or Word or whatever you want to use, paper, I don't know, and go ahead and have it separately so that you could just copy and paste it onto the portal itself. Because students email me all the time that things go wrong when they submit the assignment, and I try my best to avoid that by giving you a heads up and telling you to write it on a separate Word document. So like I said, it's gonna be open all week, and it will close at 5 p.m. So it's similar to your reading response. And I know I got some emails from students asking, do we have a reading response due this week? You actually do. But what I want you to know is that this reading response will actually um, take the place of the lowest grade that you have had in your reading response. So it means that if you have received a lower score that you want to take points for, if you complete this response, it will take away that. Because I know that students are going to be focusing on the midterm exam. So I want you to be able to have the opportunity to not submit this if you just don't have the capacity. But if you think that you would like to and you have a grade that you would like to supplement, this would automatically grant you 10 points on that grade. So um, basically, it's a one essay question. And the question is, from the readings you have engaged with so far, how do the authors frame knowledge production as feminist? In other words, what makes something feminist? And you can approach this question by considering several concepts or questions that you want to answer separately or explicitly in your response. So, how do authors identify with feminism? What do they find useful about feminism? And what are some of their critiques that they offer? And how do they offer alternatives? You can use examples from text, art, video, news articles, anything that illustrates feminist knowledge production. This is an essay response. It's an essay, so it should have a body, an intro, a conclusion, several body paragraphs, introduction, conclusion. A paragraph, remember, is 3 to 5 sentences. It should have MLA citation, or APA, whichever you want to use as long as it's consistent, works cited, references, or bibliography at the end. Um, you should also have your thesis underlined, which means that your essay needs to have an argument, and that argument needs to answer this question. What that means is, for example, in order to answer this question, you might want to look at or create an outline of authors that you enjoyed reading, maybe that you want to critique. And with these, you will be able to basically you will be able to create an argument based on similarities or differences that you see in the argument. And that is how you shape what your response is going to be in terms of what is feminist knowledge production. So if you have questions about this, please feel free to email me. It's a simple essay prompt that really is basically meant to help me see what you have learned in the course. So talk about your favorite readings, talk about the ones that you didn't enjoy, explain why, and provide an argument about how you view them as feminist. Um, so that's that for the midterm exam. The other thing that we are gonna discuss is, like I said, the reading response is available to anyone who wants to complete the um, the response to supplement a lower grade. This will automatically supplement it with a full 10 points. So make sure that you know, I mean, that doesn't mean submit a sentence, but as long as you submit a well written response, it will supplement one of your other grades as well. Um, and the but for those of you who don't have the capacity to do this, remember it is optional, so you will not lose any points if you do not complete it. I just want to be clear about that. Um, the week's pages also has a video, two videos actually, one by Bambi Salcedo that I want you to watch on transgender detainees and immigration detention, as well as a few questions that I want you to answer. If you'd like, you can review some of these extra credit materials, as well as all of the ones down below right here are also extra credit. Or, I'm sorry, my apologies, not extra credit, suggested resources. So that's that. Now we're really going to get into this week's lecture. And what I want you to focus on for this week is mostly reviewing this lecture online. If you don't have time to review all the readings, I suggest just reviewing the first couple of pages of each and mostly focusing on the PowerPoint, because I want you to really get an understanding of how we're transitioning into these concepts of body, embodiment, and health, and critical trans politics. So, first, I want us to continue with this idea that we discussed last week on the significance of the family trope. And in an essay that you were not assigned to read by Anne McClintock, um, an author, a feminist scholar who has built an argument around this notion of the family trope. She states, since the subordination of woman to man and child to adult was deemed a natural fact, other forms of social hierarchy could be depicted in familial terms to guarantee social difference as a category of nature. In other words, these concepts like family, gender, they became naturalized, and they became so dominant in their ideology, in their ideology, that they impacted how people assumed their origins, right? So basically believing that they've always existed, that this has always been the case, that these things cannot be changed. And the idea of family, this idea of the family unit, is created by these hierarchies of social difference, related to nature, related to domesticity, as we talked about last week. And these tropes mean that this notion of family is seen as inherently natural, inherently innate, similar to how gender is viewed as a natural trait determined by biology, right? So we talked about a little bit with Anne Fossil Sterling, a few different pieces. We talked about this sort of biological determinism argument about how these categories become naturalized. And this is the author here is proposing an argument that this notion of family also relates to how gender becomes determined by biology. She says the family offered an indispensable trope for figuring what was often violent historical change as natural, organic time. Since children naturally progress into adults, projecting the family image onto national and imperial progress enabled what was often murderously violent change to be legitimized as the progressive unfolding of natural decree. This means that the idea of family allows for the acceptance of hierarchy as something that is seen natural or innate to human nature. In other words, the idea of family becomes super important to state and imperial states, and it becomes an essence in which nationalism, patriotism are formed. So, I want us to pause here for a second and think about what it means to be a subject of feminist theory and who has traditionally been the conversation in feminist scholarship. A lot of the readings that we've engaged with so far have used feminist scholarship and have identified feminist scholarship as a field that focuses on particular gendered experiences, focusing on feminine, women of color, and we've talked who this category of woman is has changed over time. So all of these are the subjects of feminism. A Chicana scholar by the name of Norma Alarcón, in her essay, The Theoretical Subjects of this Bridge and Anglo-American Feminism, has talked about a very important question, which is who is the subject of feminist theory and what is her relational position to others, not just white men? So Norma Larcon asks questions about when we're engaging with feminist theory, when we're building feminist theory, who are the subjects? Who are the people that we focus on? Women of color are often left out of discussions and feminist discourse. And remember that at the time, this is still in the 80s, 90s, that we're getting scholarship discussing identity based issues and scholarship about not being accepted into spaces of dominant discourse, fighting patriarchal uh, structures within the academy and even amongst feminist scholarship, right? And we've talked about the histories of this as well in our previous lectures. She says women of color are continuously left out of discussions in feminist discourse, meaning that they're excluded from feminist theorizing on the subject of consciousness, yet they are not underrepresented in reading lists. So she says a lot of women of color scholarship is cited and used by a lot of scholars, but when it comes to critical analyzing and philosophical scholarship on consciousness, women of color are often left out. Norma Alarcón and her essay is important, and I set this kind of as like a preface or a background for us to think about contemporary conversations around who is the subject of feminist theory, as well as how people fight these narratives and build new understandings that are not just shaped by notions of cis womanhood and um, like the sort of I think it would make sense to say the sort of um, collective use and traditional use of womanhood and the cult of womanhood as a category of building feminist scholarship. We see a huge departure from that in recent decades, as more scholarship not only critiques that but becomes based on developments and understandings of gender shaped by not not uh, not rigid they're shaped by rigid were shaped by rigid understandings of sexuality and sex and gender. But we've seen and engaged with a lot of this scholarship in the last few weeks about authors really criticizing this in fields like feminist science studies, queer studies, Chicano studies. We see how a lot of these authors are actually questioning this, right? And they're bringing new categories of gender and identity to light. And many of you had questions about this in your responses last week. And I think one of the key things here is that some of these categories may be helpful and some of them maybe not. Some of them have been created by certain communities to represent some, and others are left out. So there's always conversations and room to critique them or to challenge them, but also offer new understandings, right? So a lot of times I think students focus on saying something is bad or white feminism is bad or this, but that's not really an argument. I want you to build on that by saying and explaining what developments would you offer to these critiques. If you are critiquing something, I always want you to offer new insights and offer new options for what you're questioning. So Marsha P. Johnson is one of the key figures in queer liberation movements in the last decade. We talked, I think, have we talked? I'm not sure if we talked. Maybe we haven't about the Stonewall Uprising, and in recent decades, archival projects that have reemerged her significance in these movements. And what we're going to talk about is how these politics of subjectivity shape how women of color, Black, trans, Indigenous sex workers, Black organizers, and women in liberation movements have been represented over time. One of the figures of this piece, of this lecture for this week, is a woman by the name of Roxana Hernandez, and she was recently a topic of conversation amongst several scholars, activists, communities, and the reason for her presence in these discussions was mostly because of her death in ICE detention centers in 2017. Oh, my apologies, 2019. Um, when she passed, there were a lot of discussions and efforts to raise awareness and challenge practices of detention amongst trans women who are seeking asylum or refuge into the US. Um, we have you watching a video by Bambi Salcedo that talks about her experience surviving immigrant detention. And I want you to review her organization, Trans Latina Coalition, which is a collective of trans Latinas and trans women of color who have been organizing and allocating services and building advocacy for trans Latinas who have survived um, detention, deportation, migration, sex work, trafficking. All of these are critical aspects of the organization's goals and mission. And I bring this topic to light because we're going to be moving into conversations around prison abolition and critical race studies in relation to prison studies. So I want you to start thinking about these conversations aligned, right? We talked at the beginning of the semester how we will always be thinking about gender and race and sexuality simultaneously. This is a great time for you to really put into practice those methodologies. Um, I want you to I want to read to you a section of a article that was published by the Washington Post about Roxana. It is titled ICE Detention Center May Have Allowed Video to be Deleted After Detainee's Death, Lawyers Say. On October 25, 2019, Roxana Hernandez's family was awaiting information about what happened in her final days in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement before she died in the hospital. But the surveillance footage that could help answer the question, captured by a privately run detention center, has been deleted. ICE officials indicated in emails released in response to a lawsuit. Lawyers say it's a disturbing development as they look for justice for Hernandez, a transgender asylum seeker from Honduras who died weeks after surrendering at a port of entry to the United States. The woman's death in May 2018 has fueled scrutiny of ICE's treatment of LGBTQ detainees as critics say the agency fails to provide adequate medical care for conditions such as HIV. A private autopsy also found evidence that Hernandez was physically abused, an allegation at odds with government findings. The facility's surveillance video is routinely wiped for storage reasons, according to a statement from the operator of the New Mexico facility, Core Civic. But the Transgender Law Center, which filed a wrongful death claim on Hernandez's behalf last fall, argues that ICE and its private partner on the detention center should have kept the footage in case under investigation and likely to spawn a lawsuit. The video's reported loss has made advocates even more suspicious about the circumstances around Hernandez's death, said Lainey Iglesias, the Transgender Law Center's legal director. If nothing went wrong, why wouldn't they hold on to this? Iglesias told the Washington Post. What did happen in those last hours that they chose to destroy? ICE spokeswoman Brittany Walker said the agency, quote, does not comment on pending litigation, end quote, but that its lack of comment, quote, should not be construed as agreement with or stipulation to any of the allegations, end quote, from the Transgender Law Center. Hernandez is headed to the United States with dreams of opening a beauty salon and leaving prejudice behind, a family statement says. Quote, she fled Honduras because here transgender people are discriminated against, end quote, the family said. Quote, she left with hopes of living a better life, end quote. Hernandez arrived at Cibola County Correctional Center last May, gravely ill, according to Amanda Gilchrist, a spokeswoman for Core Civic. Gilchrist said Hernandez spent 12 hours with Cibola before a medical team decided she needed immediate transport to an outside hospital. 4 days after entering ISIS custody, 33-year-old Hernandez went to the hospital with symptoms of pneumonia, dehydration, and complications associated with untreated HIV, according to Walker. Just over a week later, she died at another medical center. Staff initially attributed the death to cardiac arrest, Walker said. An autopsy by the New Mexico Office of Medical Investigator found Hernandez died of a rare disease contracted due to AIDS following a rapidly progressive illness. The Transgender Law Center contends that Hernandez died from poor medical care. The center's lawyers say her health worsened when she spent time in a cold holding area. Hernandez was also cleared for transport and incarceration the same day, and medical screening found her unfit for it, according to a write-up from the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties provided by the Transgender Law Center. Any person with common sense who encountered Roxana while she was in custody could see that she was visibly ill, Igas said in a statement. It does not take a medical degree to understand that a person who has experienced extreme weight loss, a bad cough, and intermittent fever should not be put in a cage. Shortly into her detainment, Hernandez told the Customs and Border Protection officer that she had HIV and was not on medication, according to a review commissioned by the government and released by the Transgender Law Center. She described vomiting, suffering from diarrhea, and shedding 40 pounds of the course over the month. ICE never gave Hernandez the HIV treatment she needed, the Transgender Law Center says. Even though an ICE handbook states that detainees with HIV must get a 30-day supply of prescribed medication, the government commission review of Hernandez's death says it's unclear whether she received certain treatments for other ailments recommended by medical staff after her surrender to border authorities. ICE's Health Service Corps Deputy Medical Director has said patients typically don't start HIV therapy when they have major health issues. Hernandez wasn't in custody long enough for the proper evaluations to take place, officials say. I include this excerpt from Roxana's last moments and the way that her life was shaped by the last days of her detention in ICE custody at Core Civic in New Mexico, to illuminate the ways in which the US carceral system is an extension of the US immigration system and how it relies on gendered and racial and anti trans structures to end the life of women like Roxana. And what this class hopefully will show you is that these categories are always functioning together to by dominant forces, right? So these dominant systems by the state, such as the ones that were found at Core Civic in this detention facility, and the guards, the inmates, the attorneys, all of the people who surrounded Roxana in her last moments, they all had a role in creating and upholding this system. And what I want you to focus on for this course is that these individual roles matter to a certain extent. It's the larger, broader systems in place that allow for these things to happen. And we're going to talk about Roxana's life and about how her story relates to feminist theorists' conceptions of subjectivity and the kind of representation that exists within feminist discussions of who is the subject of um, oppression, who gets represented, who does not. Um, Jane Flax is a feminist French theorist who proposes a question that I want us to think about, and we're going to talk about a few histories of these arguments. She states, can there be forms of subjectivity that are simultaneously fluid, multi centered, and effective in the outer worlds of political life and social relations? Can a multi centered and overdetermined self recognize relations of domination and struggle to overcome them? So, in other words, is it possible to acknowledge all of these multiple systems that are working together, and how they are constantly working in relation to one another? Um, is it possible to understand them and build a framework to analyze them so we can overcome them? She says that historically the subject category has always been granted to white men who embody the idea of a perfect unitary self capable of full autonomy and undetermined self reflection. But this subject category has not been accessible to Black, Indigenous, women, feminine, trans, non binary people. She says, she's not saying that I'm saying that, but I want you to think about her arguments in a contemporary standpoint. Only a multiple self can act against domination in a way that will not merely recreate it. She says it's important for us to acknowledge all of these multiple facets of oppression so that we don't replicate them, right? So, in a white feminist movement, it's important to recognize race and white supremacy so that you do not replicate it in your organizing strategies. A unitary self is unnecessary, impossible, and a dangerous illusion. She asks, what type of subject is part of the meta narrative of enlightenment? And this question is important because we're going to talk about some of the, theories of the subject and human autonomy that were created during this period of enlightenment. An undetermined one who can discover truth, right? This all knowing self, this all righteous self that was rational, orderly, and objective, not emotional, not irrational, not illogical, but objective, um, orderly, logical, and it requires a particular view of freedom and law. This autonomous individual self requires these ideas of self property, ownership, property of others, and the law is essential to maintaining this property. And here is where we really are understanding how these notions of oneself, an autonomous subject, are also what maintain structures of enslavement and genocide in place. So there are two dominant views of the self in post 17th century Western cultures. There is the Cartesian ideological structure and the human empirical one. And Flax provides these two different arguments. She says a Cartesian model is an ahistoric, solid, indwelling entity that grounds the possibility of rational thought and in turn is accessible and transparent to such thought. So the Cartesian model is this idea that we can separate our mind and body, and that we can create logical thoughts through a separation of our bodily, our embodied practices, emotions, and 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 she's very critical of this. She says this is impossible, actually. She says this Cartesian thought can engage in this Cartesian framework can engage in abstract rational thought, including thought about its own thought. And this is funny because this is so called high at the time was a very critical um, form of knowledge production that was deemed extremely challenging and only available to white men. These thoughts should remain objective and undetermined by social or bodily experiences of the thinker. So, objectivity having to understand things from an objective standpoint, not having to be submerged in it, not impacted by your own thoughts, your own ideas, not impacted by society or any bodily experiences. This Cartesian model. The human empirical model is self and its knowledge are derived from sense and experience, and any adequate account of subjectivity and thought must therefore be rendered in terms that can be expressed in, referred to, or treated by intersubjectively transmissible empirical experience. In other words, something that can be understood by another person, another sentient being, and something that can be translatable. She says, according to Flax, neither of these models are actually useful. Alternative views of the self are what she says: the subject is always internally divided, and her actions are unavoidably affected by forces outside consciousness, awareness, and control. She's using scholarship from Freud, who is a psychoanalyst, and Lacan, who were critical theorists and conceptualizations of the self, conversations around early childhood development, and how this all relates to psychoanalyst, which we've talked about this field through our last discussion about Fanon. She says postmodernists insist that subjectivity is a discursive effect, not a transcendental, ahistoric, and unchanging objective status, entity, or state. So, in other words, subjectivity is not something that is devoid of embodied experiences. It actually embraces that. It embraces bodily, sociological factors. It embraces notions of spirituality and religion. She says the feminist concept of gender has many implications for concepts of subjectivity, and these theories and practices require mechanics of fluids in which subjectivity is conceived as a set of processes rather than as a fixed entity locatable in a homogeneous, delimited time and space. In other words, these theories of identity and subjectivity cannot just be rigid. They're constantly changing, and they are constantly um, uh, exist outside of homogeneous dominant narratives. She says, while I do not believe theorists should try to or can develop a unitary, linear, prescriptive, or universally true narrative of the development and nature of the self, we can develop phenomenologies of different ways of organizing subjectivities. In other words, Flax advocates for a multiple fluid subjectivity. And we see this is happening in gender, in race analytics, in sexuality analytics. This fluidity, this is all being embraced at this time. We're actually going to skip this section. Um, so, her argument is useful for us in terms of thinking about categories of subjectivity, embodiment, and how bodily experiences come into play into feminist theorizing. So we're going to engage with disability discourse, and we talk about Rosa Marie Garland's essay, which you were expected to read, Feminist Theory, the Body and the Disabled Figure. And I include Frida Kahlo's depiction here because she's a very well known Mexican artist that talks about her art and her work through the body and through the flesh. And we've talked a lot about this in Shuri Moraga's work. We've talked a little bit about Horton Spiller's notions of flesh, and all of these theorists are conceptualizing flesh in different ways. But here we're moving towards disability studies to think about feminist theory and its relation to the body and the disabled figure. In this essay, Rosemary Thompson argues both the female body and the disabled body are cast as deviant and inferior, such as through examples of menstruation as disabling. Jane Flax even states that women are mutilated and deformed by sexist ideologies and practices. So, this is part of the kind of way that feminist scholarship and the language that it was using, um, she's actually very critical of this. She says both are excluded from public and economic life. Both are defined in opposition to a hegemonic norm, a standard idea of what is considered normal. So she's comparing this idea of the feminine body. In her words, she uses female body, but I'm going to be saying the feminine body and the disabled body. Both are defined in opposition to a hegemonic norm. So she says, similar to how the feminine body is posed in relation to this um, mainstream masculine norm, there is the disabled body is positioned in relation to an abled body. The association of femininity with disability was early introduced by Aristotle, who actually talked about femininity as monstrous, as mutilated, as disabled. She says not only does this definition of the female as a mutilated male inform later depictions of woman as diminished man, but it also arranges somatic diversity into a hierarchy of value that assigns completeness to some bodies and deficiency to others. So she says that this binary between feminine bodies as inferior to masculine bodies is is replicated in how abled bodies are seen as deficient, and how uh, abled bodies are seen as perfect and disabled bodies are seen as deficient. Aristotle defined femaleness as deviant and maleness as essential. He defined femaleness as mutilated male. This was the start of what she coins persistent intertwining of disability with femaleness in Western discourse. So, this idea of femininity in relation to disability has always been present, according to Rosemary Thompson. She says feminist theories about gender as a category can be used to think about the category of disabled. The body's role in the construction of identity and selfhood is one primary example. These complex power relations demonstrate that the body is constructed in relation to conversations around self autonomy, being able to be an individual subject, owning your own body, and ownership of other bodies. Instead of thinking about disability as lack, Thompson proposes we think of disability as a difference, but we cannot get rid of the category of disability altogether. And this is her argument here. And for your responses, feel free to argue if you agree with this, if you disagree, and why. She says the disabled body demands both accommodation and recognition. Disability highlights individual differences, and the concept of disability unites a highly marked heterogeneous group whose only commonality is being considered abnormal. This means that disability signals that the body cannot be universalized. This is a critical component to feminist conceptualizations in the early 21st century, because we start to develop a understanding about disability studies, and this is when the field starts to emerge. Rosemary Thompson argues that standpoint theory and the feminist practice of explicitly situating oneself when speaking thus allow for complicating inflection such as disability, or more broadly, body configuration attributions such as fat, disfigured, abnormal, ugly, or deformed to enter into our consideration of identity and subjectivity. In other words, when you see many of the discussions about intersectional feminism, you see that disability is continuously integrated, right? We have conversations around fat phobia, about beauty standards. All of these discussions are critical to feminist scholarship. An important binary that Rosemary Thompson situates here that is a great prompt for you to answer for your midterm exam is how disability is left out of mainstream feminism. And we see how both of these shape the way that feminist knowledge production is developed. For Rosemary Thompson, feminism resists sexual objectification. But disability, actually, she says, disabled women often encounter what Harlan Hahn has called asexual objectification, the assumption that sexuality is inappropriate in disabled people. So feminists are constantly resisting sexual objectification, but disability studies actually offers a critique of this. It says that actually asexual objectification is what a lot of disabled people have to face, not seen as viable subjects of having their own sexuality. Another example is motherhood is often seen as compulsory for women in feminist and mainstream feminist discourse. But in disability studies, the disabled body is the object of the stare. This makes the disabled body into a grotesque spectacle. And this means that disabled women are often denied or discouraged from the reproductive role that some feminist thinkers find oppressive. Another component is feminists resist the idea that care is the sole responsibility of women. But this is challenging to disability studies because making disabled women the objects of care risks casting them as helpless. Another component to feminist mainstream discourse is feminist abortion rationale seldom question the prejudicial assumption that defective fetuses destined to become disabled people should be eliminated. And another concern is that older women that are disabled tend to be ignored by mainstream feminist concepts. She says that one of the most pervasive feminist assumptions that undermines some disabled women's struggle is the liberal ideology of autonomy and independence that fuels the broader impulse towards female empowerment. And we're going to see how this notion of self autonomy continues to shape carceral politics, politics of ownership, and how this all shape legacies of enslavement, genocide, and continuous practices of colonization. She says by tacitly incorporating the liberal premise that levels individual characteristics to posit an abstract, disembodied subject of democracy, feminist practice often leave no space for the needs and accommodations that disabled women's bodies require. So, I want you to think about this section here in this quote for your response. Feel free to write a short description about your thoughts on this. We're actually going to, let's see, let me check real quick. Okay, so we're actually going to stop there because controlling the body is going to be a reading that you engage with at the end of the after spring break for week 10. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. If you have any questions about the midterm, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. You are all doing a wonderful job. I would not stress at all about the midterm exam. And please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you.